Hi, Clifford Goldstein here, and I want to welcome you to Contending for the Faith. The talk that I want to do now is called The Science of Knowledge, and it's part of a series I'm doing called Faith in Science, and we look at questions of science in our modern age and how these questions relate to issues of faith. Though quite often faith and science are in harmony, there are times when they are absolutely opposed to each other. That is, if the science is right, the particular issue of faith here has to be wrong, and vice versa. Now, the question then is not only which is right, but how do we know which one is right? And how can we know that we know which one is right? Can we really know it? Okay? These things, I admit, can get rather complicated. Nevertheless, considering the importance of the issues, it's certainly well worth our time to try the best that we can to work through them, at least to the degree we can as human beings with a greatly limited in our knowledge. Now, to begin, I want to look at an article that ran in a 2013 edition in The Economist magazine. The Economist is a very well-respected magazine, and as you can discern by its name, it deals with economic things, but it deals with politics, foreign affairs, culture. It's a very respected magazine and very, very well done. Anyway, I was reading from an October 2013 issue, and the title of the article was How Science Goes Wrong. What? Science? How does science go wrong? Isn't science kind of the ultimate standard bearer of truth? How does this go wrong? I mean, haven't we been told all our lives that science is, well, the way to get truth? When something is scientific or proven by science or comes with all the imprimatur of science, doesn't that just sort of have all the authority that makes it unchallengeable? When science speaks, what plea dare speak out against it? It's been for a long time, at least in contemporary society, contemporary culture, a sign of a lack of knowledge, of sophistication, to dare to challenge the findings of science. Well, it's fascinating because recently a book came out called Mind and Cosmos: Why the Materialistic Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. Whoa. The problem, however, was the author was not some dumb hick Bible-thumping creationist, as folks who believe in the Bible and the biblical account of origins are often depicted. Instead, he is one of the most respected intellectuals alive today. And so those who took umbrage at him at daring to challenge the latest and greatest science couldn't easily get off writing off the author, Thomas Nagel, as some illiterate yahoo who didn't get it. Nagel, I've read most of his books. He's one of the smartest, deepest thinkers writing today. Okay, so it was interesting just to see how condescending many of the attacks were on him. Well, this is just an example how the poor man doesn't understand the real issues, that kind of things. It's out of his ignorance of the facts that he would dare to question something as scientifically sound and established as the neo-Darwinian conception of how we got here. Anyway, I'd like to maybe someday come back to Thomas Nagel and his challenge to a purely materialistic worldview, which is at the heart of the neo-Darwinian view of origins. And I think the point is we have been led to believe that science is kind of a higher form of truth, a more certain kind of truth than anything else. And I think sometimes we can have good reasons for believing that, though it's important to realize, and this is something that I want to come back to one day, that you can have very good reasons, very sound reasons for believing in things that are wrong. Man, I could do a whole project, a whole program on that. Stay tuned. I think I will one day. Anyway, the point is, we have an article in a well-respected magazine talking about how science goes wrong. And I think it's something we need to look at. Now, the gist of the article is not science going wrong morally. You know, we could split the atom to make a nuclear bomb, or we can make medicine, that kind of thing. That's a whole different matter. No, the question that the article deals with is how the practice, the results, the methods of science that are being done shoddily. Let me read you a quote from The Economist. Listen to this. They were doing some studies on science, you know, looking at how science was done. See, too many of the findings that fill the academic ether are the result of shoddy experiment or poor analysis. A rule of thumb among biotechnology venture capitalists is that half of the public research cannot be replicated. And even that may be optimistic. Last year, researchers at one biotech firm, Amgen, found they could reproduce just 6 of 53 landmark studies in cancer research. Earlier, a group at Bayer, a drug company, managed to repeat just a quarter of 67 similar important papers. A leading computer scientist stressed that 3/4 of papers in his subfield are bunk. I mean, this to me is incredible. At least that would seem that people who buy the popular view of science as well, kind of an exact science, should be stunned by this, You know, it's done by a means that we're all told it has to be truth. I mean, and yet look what they're saying, one study after another. They couldn't be replicated, on and on and on. So for many people, however, if you study the philosophy and history of science, you look at things quite differently. I wasn't surprised at all, even though it was still an amazing article, even to me, who's been open to these things for a while. Let me read you another quote. This is amazing. How'd you like to be one of these people? In 2000 to 2010, roughly 80,000 patients took part in clinical trials based on research that was later retracted because of mistakes or improprieties. Come on. That's 80,000 people taking part in clinical trials based on mistakes or improprieties. I wonder how it made some of those 80,000 guinea pigs feel. The article went on to talk about the reasons for many of the problems in science. And what are they? Okay, they're competing for scarce resources, and there's a powerful tendency to exaggerate. The article said that they talked about exaggeration and cherry picking of results. In science, exaggerating, cherry picking. How do those ideas fit in with the image of scientists in a lab doing everything rationally, logically, scientifically? Also, isn't this something that peer review? We've often hear the word peer review. Well, it's peer reviewed. Well, therefore, don't question it. It's peer reviewed. I mean, what more do you need? Well, look at what this says. Listen to this quote. Okay, quote. This is again from The Economist. The whole process of peer review is not all that it's cracked up to be either. Listen to this, this is amazing. When a prominent medical journal ran research past other experts in the field, it found that most of the reviewers failed to spot mistakes it had deliberately inserted into the papers, even after being told they were being tested. Can you believe this? They purposely put mistakes in, and they missed it completely. This is peer review. Oh my goodness, I could spend an awful lot of time on this today if I wanted to, but I got different fish to fry today. Anyway, I'm bringing all this up. It's not to diss science, but it's to point out something that people tend to forget, okay? And they tend to forget that though in most cases scientists seek to study the world out there, objective reality, the things in itself, stars and rocks and birds and all that, who is doing the studying? Okay, of course, it's human beings, fallible, bigoted, subjective human beings. Science, like art and like sports and like bridge building and computer programming and music, is a human process. It's something that humans do. And thus it comes with all the inevitable and inbuilt problems that humans, by the very nature of how we are constructed, bring to whatever we do. And that includes our scientific study of objective reality. You know, if you ever study the philosophy of science, this truth about the limits of what humans can do comes home quickly. Now, some might ask, what is the philosophy of science? You know, we tend to think of them as the opposite. You know, philosophy is this kind of otherworldly musings about metaphysics and first principles, while science is kind of this nitty-gritty, getting your fingers and hands dirty study of reality. Well, I suppose there's some truth to this, but it's very small, almost to the point of being meaningless. The fact is that science, yes, science proceeds on philosophical assumptions. You can't separate science from philosophy. Indeed, in a sense, science is a form of philosophy. Now, I read a lot of the philosophy of science, and I'm reading these books. And then one day, it suddenly hit me as I'm reading these books. It suddenly hit me that really all I'm reading is I'm studying epistemology. Now, that's a fancy word. What is epistemology? I mean, we've heard of biology and theology and immunology and astronomy and so forth. And their names pretty much say what they're dealing with. But what is epistemology? Well, it's the study of episteme, which is from the Greek word that means knowledge. Now, we have to be very careful here. Epistemology is not the study of what we know. It's not the study of things like red blood cells or how the cells feed our brain or that the earth rotates on its axis or that 2 + 2 = 4. No, it's much broader than that. Instead, epistemology is the study of how do we come to know the things that we know or say that we know. It's not the, it's when we say that it's the study of things like how we know what we know. How do we know that what blood cells do? How do we know that the earth rotates on its axis? How do we know that 2 + 2 = 4? Or when I say that I know that Jesus is coming back, how do I know that? Or when I say that I know that I have a toothache, how do I know that? One thing is for sure, how I know I have a toothache is quite different from how I know that Jesus is coming back. And that's quite different from how I know that 2 + 2 = 4. And how I know, and how I know that is different from how I know that the earth rotates on its axis. In each case, I am using the same verb, know. And I mean pretty much the same thing in every case, and that my use of the verb means that I'm sure of something, that it is correct. But in each case, I know these things in very, very radically different ways. The methods, the reason, the causes, the steps, the procedures, the justifications that we use to know something vary greatly in these different areas. And see, the crucial question in epistemology then is how accurate are these different ways that we come to know what we know, or come to know what we think we know, because sometimes things we think we know, we don't really know because they turn out to be wrong. How do we know what we think we know is correct? This becomes especially important because we come to know things in radically different ways. And it's the million-dollar question that people have been wrestling with since all through known history. Solomon said in Ecclesiastes, Ein kol hadash tahat hashamesh. There's nothing new under the sun. Now think about this for a minute. How do I know that I have a toothache? Okay? Well, I feel pain in my tooth. That's about as immediate sensation as I can have. But you know, there's something very interesting here too. Some would say that this is a form of knowledge that I cannot possibly be wrong about. I could be wrong about the reasons why I have a toothache, too much candy, or a filling fell out, or I have a chipped tooth when I fell down last week. I can be wrong about my understanding, but I can't be wrong about having a toothache. Again, I could be wrong about the reasons why, or I suppose I could be dreaming, or I suppose some evil demon could be deceiving me in some way or another. But how could I be wrong about the pain in my tooth, whatever the immediate causes? I don't see how. That is something we could be pretty sure of. But you know, that's kind of ironic, because of all the ways we come to know truth and come to know things. I mean, aren't feelings about the least trustworthy? How often we are told not to trust our feelings. I mean, feelings can be very, very deceptive, right? How often have you had a gut instinct your feelings would lead you astray, even at the moment when you were absolutely sure, that your gut feeling was right? I mean, I'll tell you one thing, I'm glad that the men and women who fly jetliners don't make most of their decisions based on gut feelings. Also, can we use our feelings other ways too? I mean, I feel this table. I can feel this table, and it sure feels solid to me. I mean, it sure feels, my nerve endings touch the table and send the message to my brain that that table is hard and solid, okay? And yet, but reality, what do we know the reality about that table? Well, we know. What has science taught us? Science taught us that this table is mostly empty space. The atoms that make of it up are the teeny entities. I don't have no idea what they really are down there. That's surrounded by electrons, and they got this wide space between them. Somebody once described it. They said it's something like you had a speck of dust on the floor, and you put it in Westminster Abbey. That's how much empty space is here. And yet, my feelings tell me that it's solid, it's hard. And yet, how could I be wrong when I say that I have a toothache? And I came to know it because I can feel it. In fact, that would be the only way I could know I have a toothache. How could anybody else come to the knowledge? Not that they have a cavity or they have my chipped tooth, but they had a chipped tooth. They could know it only because they felt the pain themselves. That's one way, okay? On the other hand, how do I know that 2 + 2 equals 4? I say that I know 2 + 2 equals 4, and I could say that I know that I have a toothache. Again, I'm using the same verb know to mean the same basic thing, but I have knowledge about those things in completely different ways. Clearly, how I know I have a toothache is not how I know that 2 + 2 equals 4. I don't feel that 2 + 2 equals 4. I don't put my hand on the math equation and, oh, I can feel it. 2 + 2 equals 4, and it sends signals to my brain and tells me that, okay? Yet I know 2 + 2 equals 4, just as surely as I know I have a toothache. And yet it's true. I know them in radically different ways. the equation that comes from a rational understanding of what the number 2 stands for, and what the plus sign stands for, and what the equal sign stands for, and what the number 4 stands for. There's a certain rational and logical formula and a logical relationship between the 2 and the plus and the equals and the 4. And that causes me to say 2 plus 2 equals 4. Fair enough. Okay, that's basically how we come to knowledge, but it's a whole different route than you know you have a toothache. What else can I say? What else do we know? I could say, I know that the Earth is rotating on its axis, but how do I know the Earth is rotating on its axis? I mean, it sure doesn't feel it's rotating on its axis. And if I wanted to, I could throw something up. I could do an experiment right now. What would challenge it? I can throw a rock up in the air, and if I throw it straight up, if the Earth were rotating, wouldn't the rock go one way or another way? Instead, it falls straight down. So how do I know the Earth is rotating on its axis? Yet I say I know that it is, the same way I say I know I have a toothache, the same way I know 2 plus 2 equals 4. It was funny, there was a philosopher, Ludwig Wittgenstein, and somebody once was mocking the ancients, those stupid ancients, for actually thinking the Earth stood still and the sun moved across the sky. And Wittgenstein said, well, I wonder what it would look like if the sun really were moving across the sky. Of course, the point is it would look exactly the same. But anyway, how many of you listening right now, you know that the Earth is rotating on its axis? You know it? You're sure of it? But you don't know it how you know you have a toothache or a backache, do you? Or in my case, I got a broken finger ache because I broke my finger. Or do you know it rationally, the way you know 2 plus 2 equals 4? I mean, there's nothing deductive. Nothing that follows that the Earth must rotate on its axis. God could have created the world somewhere else. But you say you know that the Earth is rotating on its axis. How do you know that? Well, that's even another kind of knowledge. This is the type of knowledge that is revealed to you, told to you by other sources. And please, how reliable is that? I mean, come on. Have you not been told things by others that have turned out to be utterly, utterly wrong? How much wrong information is out there? How many people believe wrong things that have been told them? And yet, think about it too. There's an awful lot we know because it's been told us. Where were you born? How do you know that you had been born where you were told you were born? I was born in Albany, New York. I mean, I was there at my birth, but it doesn't do me a whole lot of good, at least as far as epistemology goes. I know I was born there because I've been told, and I have pretty good reasons to believe those who told me that. But this leads to something else. Maybe people told you in the past things were right. Maybe they told you those things were right. They tell you this new thing, and every time you get, and maybe somebody told you something, and every time they told you it was right. Okay? Thus, you have valid reasons for thinking each time this person told you something it was right. Okay? And maybe you do. But maybe just because a source was right the first time, or the first 50 times, or the first 50,000 times, doesn't mean the source is going to be right the next time it gives you information. You know, we can get into all things like odds and statistics, and if someone told you something correct 100 times in a row, then you would have reasons to believe them, to trust him for the 101st time. Instead, if he told you something once, you'd have reason to trust him again. We could get into all that. The point is, there's still a chance of what they told you being wrong. Thus, the question in all this is, how reliable are the means that we come to the various ways we know something? And this comes back to what I said earlier. I said, when you study science, you are studying a form of epistemology. It's a very distinct means of seeking to come to knowledge. And as some would argue, it's not a really very reliable means of coming to knowledge. And we're going to look at that more in our next, we're going to look at that more in our next talk. But as we close, I want you to look at one more question about when we look at epistemology and we look at science. How reliable can it be? Because again, we looked at those studies in the beginning. They got all this scientific method, all these things, and look at all the mistakes that they made. But see, epistemology, though, presents a very big problem. Let's say I want to study my epistemology. I want to come to know how it is I know the things I know. But that leads to a big problem. How do we study epistemology itself? How do we study the methods of knowledge when they are the very things we are using to study to begin with? The methods of knowledge. These are the things we're questioning. We can study biology, we can study physiology, astronomy, theology, using various methods of epistemological tools. Reason, logic, our senses, revelation, things revealed by God or humans or revealed to us by someone else. And that's all fine. But how do we study these tools themselves when the tools themselves are the very things that we are questioning? How do we study the very things that we're using to conduct the study itself? If you're using reason to study reason, you're kind of going in a circle, right? And if you're using your senses to study your senses, then you're going in a circle. How can you trust your senses to teach you about your senses, especially when your senses are the very things you're questioning in the first place? And I guess this all boils down. I think in many ways, when we look at science, we have to remember we are looking at a fallible human endeavor. We're looking at fallible, subjective human beings with prejudices, with their own ideas, with their own agendas. And I think what we looked at in the beginning shows us that, because science is a form, as we said, of epistemology. It's a form it's a way of trying to learn about the world. And it can be a very, very fruitful way, but it also can be a way filled with a lot of pitfalls. And I think I can so relate to the words of the Apostle Paul, because even though he was talking specifically about faith, it's broader than that. He said, "For we see through a glass darkly." That's his way of saying we are limited in what we know, and that includes science as well.